Hello everyone. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all to our public lecture. I am Professor Claire Johnson, Director of the ACU Centre for Liturgy, and on behalf of the Centre's staff and of all of the people at Australian Catholic University, I welcome you here today from wherever you are joining us around Australia and around the world. The topic of our public lecture is the Ars Celebrandi. It's everyone's responsibility. The Ars Celebrandi is not mentioned in Sacrosanctum Concilium, and in fact, it's a concept that's of quite recent vintage in liturgical discussions. It makes its first official appearance in Pope Benedict XVI's 2007 post-synodal apostolic exhortation on the Eucharist, known as Sacramentum Caritatis. Pope Benedict mentions the Ars Celebrandi within the context of a discussion of beauty and the liturgy, noting that the liturgy properly celebrated is beautiful, is an act of beauty. Beauty is understood to be an aspect of God, a way in which the truth of God's love in Christ encounters us, attracts us and delights us, enabling us to emerge from ourselves and drawing us toward our true vocation, which is love. In a Christian worldview, beauty as an aspect of God involves making reference to Christ, the human face of God, who reveals God as love, who demonstrates through his actions, words, life, death, and resurrection, the reality of God's beauty in a way that is accessible within the limits of human comprehension. This beauty, this aspect of God's self, is accessible to us all in the proper celebration of liturgy. I am delighted to welcome my friend, colleague, and our esteemed guest speaker for this morning's public lecture. The Very Reverend Father Peter G. Williams was born in Melbourne and brought up in the Anglican Church. He holds a BA in Medieval Studies and Philosophy from Australian National University, a BThol from Australian College of Theology, a BEd from La Trobe University, an MThol from the University of Sydney, and an MA in Liturgical Studies from Catholic University of America. In 2014, he was awarded the Doctor of the University from ACU, and happily he was made a member of the Order of Australia in the 2022 Australia Day Honours for service to the Catholic Church and to higher education. Father Peter was ordained a Catholic priest in 1992 and has held appointments in many parishes in the Diocese of Parramatta, serving as Dean of St Patrick's Cathedral Parish in Parramatta 2004 to 2006. From 2011 to 2014, he was Vicar General in the Diocese of Parramatta and Episcopal Vicar for Social Welfare. Father Peter is currently Vicar General and Moderator of the Curia, appointed in 2011, and the Director of Liturgy, appointed in 1998 in the Diocese of Parramatta. Father Peter was the Director of Liturgy for World Youth Day in Sydney in 2008 and was responsible for planning all of the liturgical celebrations surrounding World Youth Day and the papal visit. He served as Executive Secretary of the National Liturgical Commission from 2000 to 2011 and was charged with overseeing the implementation of the new translation of the Roman Missal. He served as Chair of the National Liturgical Music Board 2005 to 2016, coordinating the publication of the Catholic Worship Book 2. He's also a member of the National Liturgical Art and Architecture Board and has been since 2010. Father Peter presently teaches at the Catholic Institute of Sydney, from where he joins us with his students today, and he lectures and runs workshops on liturgy around Australia. Happily, he is also a greatly valued member of the Board of Advisors for the ACU Centre for Liturgy. Please join me in welcoming our wonderful guest lecturer, Father Peter Williams.
Well, good morning to you all from wherever you are. I want to begin by acknowledging with respect the land upon which I'm giving this lecture today of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation here in Strathfield in Sydney. And as Claire has already mentioned, I have my normal liturgy class here this morning at ACU. A worldwide crisis has often been the opportunity for individuals, groups, organisations and nations to engage in some sort of reset. This is seen as a way of positively moving forward into the future, with valuable lessons having been learned from whatever the crisis has been. There is little doubt that the COVID pandemic has already provided such a platform for either minor or substantial recalibration in various aspects of organised human behaviours, from the way we work in future and how we spend our leisure time. For those of us concerned with the public worship of the Catholic Church, and indeed for all liturgically based communities of believers, questions have been raised about what COVID has taught us about the nature of communal worship, the needs and aspirations of individual worshippers, and moving into the future, it is likely to have an enduring effect upon the way we gather and what we do when the community meets to engage in public rituals. That we have witnessed a fracture in our previously held understanding of participation as a result of live-stream liturgical celebrations during the course of the lockdowns in many countries is obvious and raises new questions about how individuals connect to their faith communities and whether some of the changes to our liturgical praxis, which were a result of COVID protocols, will be permanent. Can a person truly participate in a liturgical celebration virtually? And what does it say about the corporeal expectation that is intrinsic to the forming of the body of Christ assembling for Sunday Eucharist? It also challenges some of our most cherished understandings that emerged from the liturgical renewal following the reforms of the Second Vatican Council. With the continuation of live streaming, and given the metrics around the number of views is any indication, then as a present reality and an option for some Catholics, it is not going away anytime soon. What does this mean for the presuppositions we've adhered to previously that participation in worship requires a physical, embodied presence with others who then properly constitute the liturgical assembly as the body of Christ? Is there theologically such a thing as a virtual assembly? And if so, what does that mean in terms of sacramental engagement? In one archdiocese in Australia, the Archbishop has established a virtual parish and appointed a pastor. The pandemic has changed the mindset of believing Catholics who were quite content in joining worshipping communities scattered around the world. During one of the lockdowns, I was informed by a member of a religious congregation that she had found an online worshipping community in the northeast of the United States that satisfied all her expectations in terms of what constitutes good liturgy. Music that appeals, good preaching, and even an online forum where the congregants could gather after Mass. If celebrating the liturgy is everyone's responsibility, as the title of this lecture suggests, then what will that mean in the future for assemblies who physically meet and those who choose to be connected virtually, and significantly for those who lead them in public prayer? According to Pope Benedict XVI, Ars Celebrandi is explained in his post-synod exhortation from the 2002 Synod on the Eucharist. In Sacramentum Caritatis it reads, quote, "In the course of the Synod, there was frequent insistence on the need to avoid any antithesis between the Ars Celebrandi, the art of proper celebration, and the full, active and fruitful participation of all the faithful. The primary way to foster the participation of the people of God in the sacred rite is the proper celebration of the rite itself. The Ars Celebrandi is the best way to ensure their actuosa participatio. The Ars Celebrandi is the fruit of faithful adherence to the liturgical norms in all their richness. Indeed, for 2,000 years, this way of celebrating has sustained the faith life of all believers called to take part in the celebration as the people of God, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, unquote. Some liturgical scholars have opined that Benedict's intention was that in the so-called reform of the reform, a hybrid rite would emerge that would restore some elements of the Missal of Pius V to the Novus Ordo, leading then to the assumption that the Novus Ordo was or is in some way inadequate as a liturgical form. In the quotation from the exhortation, the key question that leaps from the page in the light of our recent experience is, how do we define what the proper celebration of the rite is? To assist in focusing on this question in the light of the pandemic and the new challenges that have emerged for liturgical scholars and practitioners, it might be helpful to utilise analytical tools that come from outside our normal context when it comes to critiquing liturgical engagement and practice. The social sciences can assist in this exploration, and in the discipline of sociology, there is a methodological framework that can assist the student of liturgy in this quest. It was in the mid-19th century that the terms high culture and popular culture first appeared, and then were often portrayed as binary opposites. So what constitutes high culture? It is variously defined, but one sociologist has expressed it in this way. High culture is generally used to denote forms of culture such as visual arts, opera, classical music, and literature. Based on widely shared beliefs, these forms of culture are, in contrast to the more popular forms of culture, deemed valuable and worthy of appreciation. Often people who are attracted to high culture are also part of a class of persons who are highly educated and are often identified as belonging to an elite class within a society. Popular culture, or pop or mass culture, refers to cultural products such as music, art, literature, fashion, dance, film, sport, cyberculture, television, and radio that are consumed by most of the society's population. British media specialist John Story has offered 6 different definitions of popular culture. Of the 6, one suggests that popular culture is whatever is left after you have identified what high culture is, which would imply that pop culture or mass culture is inferior to high culture. In another, Story has postulated that, quote, popular culture is folk culture, something that arises from the people rather than being imposed on. Pop culture is authentic, which might seem to imply that high culture lacks validation in terms of being authentic in the way that mass culture is. Let us delve into that area of inquiry where sociologists and those in media studies identify what are in effect substratum that either fit in the high or the popular cultural designation. This subset is referred to as a specific taste culture. It has been defined as, I quote, a cultural strain that reflects the preference of a group for a particular cultural product. Membership of the group may be determined by many factors, including ethnic origin, education, social class, age, gender, and country or place of residence. Preference for certain activities often depends on the taste culture with which a person identifies, unquote. Now, you may well be wondering, what has this got to do with Christian liturgy and its praxis? I want to propose that prior to the Second Vatican Council, the Church had, at least since the Council of Trent, and perhaps even earlier from the medieval period, developed its own unique taste culture. Whilst it might have reflected some local variations due to whether it was being celebrated in the Catholic world, it was essentially impervious to the prevailing cultural norms of whatever society or ethnic group it found itself, given the strict rubrical adherence that was demanded as a response to the Tridentine reform. Given that the Missal of Pius V was rooted in the crucible of Renaissance Europe, it appropriated quite naturally much of the prevailing cultural paraphernalia to which European society of the 16th century had developed as part of the transition from the medieval world to the High Renaissance, particularly in terms of the arts. And as students of the history of liturgy know only too well, that form and liturgical culture became a fixed and immutable for almost 500 years. This unique cultural expression of the liturgy was accepted as the norm by which the Church celebrated its liturgical rites, and it remained unquestioned until the liturgical reforms were mandated after the Second Vatican Council. We know from the history of the liturgical movement in the 19th century that cracks were beginning to appear in the Tridentine Rite when local permissions were given to the singing of hymns in the vernacular and the revision of the Holy rites in the mid-1950s. Nevertheless, the somewhat visceral reaction of a number of individuals and groups following the reforms, particularly as enunciated in Bugnini's monumental work on the reform of the liturgy, is quite understandable. Having been shaped by a unique and highly stylised liturgical culture for centuries, there would at least be some degree of antipathy towards a new form of worship that disconnected it from the previous culture. While some of the invective against the liturgical reforms were purportedly based on various theological issues, that the new liturgy did not emphasise sufficiently the sacrificial nature of the Mass, that there was a diminution in the role of the real presence, or that the role of the priest had been diminished, I believe that it was largely a reaction to a substantial and comprehensive change to the cultural idiom. The Novus Ordo now had the courage of mediating a new approach and method of engagement for the baptised members of the Church in the celebration of the liturgy, which was not necessarily going to be culturally bound to one expression or form. The liturgical reforms and the renewal called for a change of liturgical culture, not just a change of words, structure, and language. And to that end, very little serious attention has been given to the question of culture by those responsible for the reform and its implementation, because the focus of the reformers was more textually directed. One has only to look at the first and second instructions post the reform that were issued by the congregation to understand that fact. Regardless of the critique made by liturgical scholars that congregations prior to the council had an impoverished understanding of their role in terms of their active participation in the liturgy, that a paucity of exposure to sacred scripture was detrimental to their growth in faith, that the use of a dead language disconnected the faithful from the celebration they were attending, that the focus was for many on private devotions, that the liturgy had become moribund. The fact is that this unique cultural expression provided validity to their self-understanding as believing Catholics. And it was this liturgical culture and its extension through pre-Vatican II parish life, with its sodalities, societies, and a plethora of other related, uniquely Catholic activities that confirmed this identity. This is not to suggest that the liturgical reforms were not needed. As we now know, the reception of the Reformed liturgy by the people of God has been overwhelmingly positive. But it does point to the fact that it is more than just the use of an antiquarian rite that is at issue here. That we have struggled with the motivations of those who want to worship using pre-conciliar forms remains, of course, célèbre in our own day. And whilst a very small demographic in the total membership of the Church, they nevertheless continue to agitate for the preservation of what they consider to be a form of liturgy that best serves their spiritual, ecclesial and cultural needs. Whilst the recent motu proprio Pope Francis is yet another attempt to address what has now become more of an ecclesiological divide than a liturgical conundrum, it still comes back to the power of a taste culture to shape a person's self-understanding of their place in the world, and in this case, in the life of the Church. So let me put forward another thesis about the reception of the liturgical reforms of the Council and what has transpired since. The shift to the liturgy in the vernacular and the provisions of the post-conciliar documents, which supported the adaptation of the liturgy to better align with local cultures. The name we most associate with this movement is enculturation, and championed principally, but not exclusively, by Ansgar Chipungo, resulted in the collapse of that unique taste culture that had predominated in the Catholic world and was one of the so-called hallmarks of Catholic identity. One has often heard the claim, no matter where you went in the world before the Council, the Mass was always the same. That could hardly be said now. I must note here that recent scholarship suggests that perhaps there might have been more variations in the way Mass was celebrated that might challenge that adage. What has emerged over the past 50 years is the rise of an overabundance of unique liturgical taste cultures, which naturally enough reflect the language and local Indigenous culture of groups in which the liturgy is celebrated. Some liturgical scholars would argue that this is what the Council Fathers wanted in terms of the liturgical reform and renewal. But we might also ask, is this really what the Council Fathers thought they were inaugurating with the reform? They simply could not have foreseen, once permission was obtained to translate Latin into the vernacular languages, what would transpire. Thus, in the English-speaking world, and here I can only make observations on what has emerged in Australia, a variety of cultural expressions of the Roman Rite often reflect the cultural biases and the taste culture of the clergy, particular groups of lay people who are influential in parish life, and sometimes members of religious congregations who also strongly influence the liturgical life of a parish. And then there is the influence of those engaged in liturgical music, which often can be a unique subclass because they often derive from a particular ethnic group, which in turn relies on a particular musical repertoire, much of which has been imported from somewhere else. In other words, what I am suggesting is that the Roman Rite, as it is practiced in our parishes, has become largely an expression of popular or mass culture, which is manifested in various subsets depending on the demographic of those leading and participating in it. Even a cursory wandering through social media, in this case Instagram, will present an amazing array of the different cultural expressions of Catholic liturgy from around the world, which all the practitioners would concur was, in their judgment, an authentic expression of the Roman Rite in the post-Vatican II world. We need to accept that liturgical cultural plurality is here to stay, and that any expectation that there will emerge in any one language group a mono-liturgical culture that will predominate is simply utopian. In other words, to use the language of the commercial world, it has become a user's market that is driven by whatever appeals as the best liturgical product that suits the worshipper and the liturgical practitioners who make it happen. And so increasingly, the active churchgoer will choose to worship in an environment that they find conducive to their own taste culture. For most people in our parish system, they will probably be content to frequent the local church, which will largely reflect popular or mass culture with perhaps some local flavour that is influenced by the ethnic makeup of the assembly. If there was ever a prevailing high culture in Catholic liturgy, and that I suggest is quite arguable, it will not find much expression except perhaps in a few cathedrals and other places that seek to preserve a particular aesthetic in music, which is normally best experienced within a particular architectural setting, and coupled with that a concern for the correct choreography of the liturgical rites. I think for too long, with our understandable adherence to the liturgical principles expressed in the Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy, which sees the ultimate goal as the full, conscious and active participation of the faithful by reason of their baptism, many expected rather naively, as it turned out, that this would somehow be expressed through a monocultural form of the Roman Rite, which in turn would be shaped by those attending, comprehending the privileged position of the fully initiated by an informed understanding of their role in the celebration of the Eucharist. Liturgical scholars perhaps should have been more attentive to the social sciences and the omnipresence of taste cultures and the hegemony of popular culture in exerting a dominance over the way people express themselves in the ordinary living of their lives, which, understandably, would strongly influence the way in which they prefer to worship. Whether we like it or not, the majority of those who continue to participate frequently in Sunday Mass and other public religious observances do so for a vast array of different reasons. The number of those who would see their participation as a manifestation of their baptism in giving expression to being plunged into the Paschal mystery through the celebration of the Eucharist would be, I suggest, minuscule. The understanding around this identification with the Paschal mystery, as we know, is not original to the principles enunciated in the Constitution. The similar principles can be found in the Motu Proprio Pope Pius X, and is certainly evident in the writings of those who spearheaded the liturgical movement in the 19th and 20th centuries. The cursory glance over any liturgical assembly will reveal those who never utter a word, those who never sing, those who will engage in some parts of the liturgy and not others, and those who participate fully through spoken response and song. Perhaps there may well be a class of persons in our liturgical assemblies who we must accept are liturgical introverts, who see themselves as being very present to the liturgical action, even though from appearances they seem not to be engaged. Then we must ask, Does active participation imply that everyone must sing and must respond? Or have we too narrowly defined what full, conscious and active participation means? In addition to that, we are faced with a multiplicity of styles in those who preside over our liturgical assembly. Poor formation in liturgical leadership in seminaries and other houses of formation means that many of the ordained are not equipped to lead public liturgical prayer. For some, it is simply a vehicle by which their personality can find expression in either a strict adherence to an almost robotic interpretation of the rubrics, where the presence of an assembly is almost a hindrance to their perceived role, a look at me mentality, or to the other end of the spectrum, where the ordained see themselves as providing some sort of light-hearted quasi-religious entertainment week by week, interspersed with some liturgical texts from the Missal in the style of some reality television shows. Presiders who arbitrarily change the texts, add, subtract, and reword them are more prevalent than one would like to imagine. Recently, I was advised of a parish where the priest on Good Friday reordered the liturgy, engaged members of the assembly in liturgical roles that are stipulated to be ordained ministries, so that the celebration would be more pastorally meaningful to those present. Who would ask is the proper arbiter of such decisions? Whilst many in the liturgical establishment are known to express concern about a younger generation of clergy who seem to be obsessively rubrical and want to invest the liturgy with a more sober and some would say traditional approach to the celebration in terms of style, music, and a more conservative liturgical environment, there is also ample evidence of the so-called post-Vatican II clergy whose liturgical understanding denotes a lack of or very little proper liturgical formation and is still locked into the mentality of the 1970s and 80s, a time when the liturgical renewal was still in a state of flux and various episodes of reckless experimentation abounded. When challenged by new and often younger members of the parish who seemingly are looking for something different and request a review of the Ars Celebrandi in that community, they are often met with hostility and claims of liturgical infallibility when it comes to any discussion around the worship practice of the parish. If you engage in a search or choose to view the number of recorded liturgies from all over the world that have accrued in the electronic databases on YouTube and Facebook, you will see exactly what I mean. Considering all this lack of stability in the liturgical practice of the Church, one can have some sympathy for those who seek a celebration of Mass, which is stable and provides the necessary framework to enable people to pray without the anxiety of being unsure of what comes next in terms of liturgical surprises. As the noted scholar Alan Griffiths once said, when a liturgy is celebrated, those attending have the right to feel safe within the environment. And that means the stable nature of the liturgical rite will be respected by those leading and celebrating it. Moving forward then, we are confronted with several questions as to engage in the reset following the pandemic. What to do? Firstly, it is urgent that those responsible for the conduct of the liturgy in our parishes, and by that I mean the bishop as the moderator of the liturgical life of the diocese, ensures that those ordained in the local church have proper and adequate liturgical training so that they understand their role in the liturgy and develop the necessary skills to lead public prayer and know how to effectively celebrate the rites. The Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy in paragraphs 16, 17 and 18 address this matter, particularly in reference to the primary place that liturgy should have in seminarian formation and in houses of study, but it has never been adequately implemented. And I suspect that one of the reasons why we find ourselves in this liturgical miasma in many of our parishes is because of this failure to follow through on what the Constitution requested. Secondly, the next paragraph, 19, focused on the liturgical formation of the people, which was identified as a high priority for pastors as the liturgical renewal unfolded. As we well know, this has been somewhat haphazard in application. And whilst there have been various attempts since the Council to provide various programs of liturgical catechesis and formation, it has been inconsistent, and such endeavours only tend to attract those who are already appreciative of the liturgical principles that underpin the reform. While such initiatives have been welcomed, they simply have not penetrated to the majority of those who still attend Sunday Eucharist. Thirdly, in a spirit of mutual respect, we must dialogue with those who feel a sense of alienation from the missal of Paul VI and try to appreciate what draws them to more primitive forms of the liturgy. It may well be that they have insights that might profit those responsible for the liturgy as it is celebrated today. And in a spirit of reciprocity, they might be led to understand the genius of the liturgical form rather than continue to engage in an environment of mutual hostility, which is hardly reflective of the unity that is supposedly key to our belonging to the one body that is Christ. I suspect that Benedict XVI had hoped that might be an outcome of Summorum Pontificum, but as we now know, it was hijacked by certain elements in the Church that had another agenda, which was not necessarily driven by liturgical issues, hence Pope Francis's Traditionis Custodes. I remain optimistic that with goodwill, humility, and an openness to admit that we haven't always got it right in the implementation of the liturgical reform over the past 50 years, we might see this as a kairos moment to act for the good of the whole Church as we continue our journey of faith as a pilgrim people. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Father Peter, for that fascinating and engaging lecture. We are very fortunate today to be able to welcome questions from all of our participants here to Father Peter. But before we open the floor for questions, it is my pleasure to introduce an invited respondent to offer her thoughts on Father Peter's presentation. My friend and colleague, Dr. Jenny O'Brien, is the team coordinator and chief liturgy educator for the Office for Worship in the Archdiocese of Adelaide in South Australia. Jenny has been an integral part of the Office for Worship team for over 25 years, and in 2018 took on the role of team coordinator. She's a liturgist, a musician, a composer and educator, and provides workshops and short courses and assistance in all matters liturgical. Let us please welcome Dr. Jenny O'Brien.
Sorry, Claire, just unmuting. Thank you very much. Thank you, Peter. It is my pleasure to be able to respond to you as a colleague of many years standing, having worked with you on quite a number of projects. I thank you for your wisdom, your balance, and your gentle humour. These past years of pandemic have indeed raised many questions around our liturgical celebrations, many of which you have brought clearly into focus this morning with your presentation. The foundational ecclesiological notion of gathering as the body of Christ seems to me to stand in first place. From the earliest days of the Church, the faithful have gathered on the Lord's Day to share Eucharist. We find this clearly recorded in Acts, especially Acts 20. And while the argument can be made that there is genuine assembling in the virtual world, with the opportunity to be nourished by the proclamation and breaking open of the word, the same cannot be said for sharing from the table of the Eucharist. And I find it very interesting as a liturgy educator to have spent a good deal of time trying to help people understand the difference between the Eucharist and a liturgy of the word with Holy Communion, whereas often for them, the important thing was simply to receive communion, regardless of whether this was an act as a result of the Eucharistic action or merely a distribution from the tabernacle. And yet, in the world of live streaming and virtual assembly, this is the very thing that they must forego. Your question in reference to Pope Benedict XVI's plea for the proper celebration of the rite is also most relevant. How do we define just what the proper celebration of the rite is? I strongly agree with your judgment that the focus of the Second Vatican Council reformers was, for the most part, textually oriented, even though the overall reforms called for a change of the liturgical culture and not just a change of words, structure, and language. We have all seen the variety that exists even when presiders and assembly members follow exactly the texts and rubrics set down for the celebration of the Eucharist, since so many other factors need to be taken into account. Your description of a taste culture provides a welcome lens through which to view the situation and reflect on the ways in which this has resulted in a fracturing of that unique liturgical culture that did prevail in Roman Rite Catholics prior to the Second Vatican Council. Interpretation of paragraphs 37 to 39 of the Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy, dealing with the adaptation of the liturgy to the temperament and traditions of peoples, has gone well beyond accommodation of cultural differences arising from geography and ethnicity to almost a compulsion to take into account the multiplicity of subcultures that exist in any given location, which you so aptly describe as an overabundance of unique liturgical taste cultures. I was particularly interested in your comments on the influence of the clergy and high-profile lay persons and parish musicians in shaping the local expression of the Roman Rite, and your reminder to us that the interpretation of the axiom full, conscious and active participation varies greatly among mass goers. You suggest that increasingly the active Catholic churchgoer will choose to worship in an environment that they find conducive to their own taste culture. I would suggest that in many cases, even this is becoming less and less possible, often due to the situation that you name, that many of the ordained are not equipped to lead liturgical prayer. And while this does and can arise from a lack of suitable formation or perception by the priest that he is at the centre of the celebration rather than the presider of the assembled body of Christ, I think that the Australian Catholic Church is also facing the difficult situation of so many parish priests who have been invited from overseas countries to serve people whose taste cultures, plural, are often beyond the lived experience of the priest. Now, I recognise that such decisions have been made by the Australian hierarchy with the best of intentions, but it must be acknowledged that barriers of language and culture are a reality. I turn finally to the three suggestions you offer as ways forward so that we can reset our liturgical compass following the pandemic. It is imperative that our bishops ensure that our clergy, including themselves, are properly and adequately trained. However, the priests and deacons must be open to this and not cling to the belief that the ontological change wrought by ordination suddenly renders their intellect superior to those who have studied liturgy assiduously for many years, including women, and that there is nothing they could learn from them. Of course, this attitude does not exist in all clergy, but it is prevalent enough to warrant mention. Secondly, formation of the faithful is vital and urgent. And I notice it's always high on the list of what people want when parishioners are asked of ways to build up the faith community. But attendance at things like workshops and courses is often low, which indicates that we need to offer formation and training in different modes. And I'm delighted that an increase on online learning and the use of social media shows that we are finally catching up with an aspect of modern culture too long ignored. But it may also indicate that costs associated with ongoing formation and training are often a barrier to participation. Your final point regarding the need for dialogue with those whose views differ from our own is, I feel, absolutely essential. It is not just clergy who are guilty of thinking that their position or stance is the only right one. Each one of us, as members of the body of Christ, needs to have the qualities that you so rightly name: humility, goodwill, and openness. The liturgy is not meant to be a source of division, but as Pope Francis says, a prayerful event where Christians encounter Christ's presence in their lives. Thank you again for your perceptive presentation and the insights you have given us this morning.
Thank you so much, Jenny. That was very comprehensive and excellent. Greatly appreciated. Father Peter, did you have a response to Jenny's response? We'll start with that if you'd like to jump on in.
Thanks very much, Claire. No, I just want to thank Jenny for her insights. I think that one of the things that Jenny said that I didn't mention in my essay, but which is a lived reality for the Church in Australia, and that she picked up on, and I think is very valid, is what do we do with the clergy who come from overseas, who themselves come from a unique culture, their own taste culture, and all of a sudden they find themselves inserted into an Australian setting. Now, in the multicultural mix where I minister in Western Sydney, the dissonances that can sometimes happen probably aren't as marked as they might be if you bring somebody who's spent their entire life overseas in another culture and you plot them in the middle of a rural culture, where basically you're dealing with Anglo-Celtic people and their own cultural experience. So, Jenny, that's a wonderful point, well made, and it's one that I think we all need to think about, particularly as we move to the next calibration that we need to do now coming out of lockdown. So that's the comment I'd make, Claire. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Father Peter. We have one question in the chat, and I encourage people, if you have questions, either to raise your hand or to write them in the chat. But Charles Rue has come through with a question here for you, Peter, and he's written, given the restlessness of many looking for better liturgical celebrations, do you have any suggestions on creating effective formal avenues to welcome, monitor, and share positive initiatives?
Oh, that's a really large question that Charles has asked, but I have to say it's also a very pertinent one. I think what's happening, Claire, and I'd say the same thing to Charles, is I think with the fact that so much of our lives now is generated by what happens online, I actually think people are engaged in their own searches now. And I think they're shopping around. There'll always be that group of people that I mentioned in the lecture who will be very content to go to the local parish church. But for those who have a more discerning view about what they're wanting to experience in the celebration of the liturgy, I think what they will do is that they'll shop around, and often they'll do that by jumping online, and there's so much material there. In preparation for this liturgy, you would be surprised at the number of TikTok reels on Instagram where people have taken grabs out of their local liturgical celebrations, particularly around Easter. you can go anywhere. And if you do that search, I think people will quickly work out where they want to land. In terms of actually collecting that information and making that available, that's a big research project. And I'm just not quite sure how you would go about doing that. Maybe that might be something the ACU Centre for Liturgy might do.
We can certainly look into it. Are there any other questions that people would like to raise their hands and turn on their microphones and ask? Just feel free to let me know or write your questions in the chat. We have a question from Marius. Marius has written, Father Peter, both you and Jenny talked about good education or preparation for presiding over the liturgical assembly as indeed very important, no doubt, but isn't the understanding of what good presiding is dependent on the person's cultural taste and background? Would anyone disagree that good preparation is important? I would think not, and yet we have such a vast diversity of understanding of what good presiding is. Comments, Peter?
I think it's because that previously in seminary formation, prior to the council, students for the priesthood were given very detailed training in how to celebrate the Missal of Pius V. And so because there was no room for any variation, and it was simply the case of say the black and do the red, as people used to quote, it was possible that priests could be formed in such a way because that was how the liturgy was to be celebrated. And really, it was locked in, as I mentioned. I remember many years ago at a meeting of the National Liturgical Commission in Parramatta when Bishop James Foley, the Bishop of Cairns, was attending the meeting, and he made the comment that the Reformed liturgy that emerged out of the Second Vatican Council gave a platform for the individual personality of the priest in a way that was probably never envisaged, was not thought through, that having a liturgical celebration which was one in the vernacular and two provided a fair degree of flexibility to a certain extent would enable priests to invest their personalities in such a way that hitherto had just not been the experience of the church previously, at least in the plane of prayers and leading the liturgical celebration. So I think that's one of the issues that we've never really quite got our heads around. That we provided a platform for individual personalities, depending on who the person was, to actually virtually take off.
Thank you, Father Peter. We have a comment from Father Kevin Lenihan, who thanks you and says, so can we even talk about enculturation of the liturgy in this multi-taste culture? What would be the goal or aim of enculturated liturgy as discussed after Vatican II in today's context?
Oh, I think in those terms, I think in some ways, as I addressed in the lecture, I think the horse is bolted in the sense that I think we have a plurality now of culture, liturgical culture. And I can't see that, as I said, to think that somehow everybody can be funneled into one expression culturally of how the Roman Rite is celebrated here in Australia is just, it will never happen. I mean, the horse is bolted on that. And I think what we have to accept now is that we have this multiplicity of expressions of the Roman Rite in terms of taste cultures that have emerged around the country. And somehow we've got to get a better understanding, which is why I call for perhaps a greater engagement by liturgical scholars with the social sciences as to what are the underpinnings that lead to the emergence of such culture. and how are those cultures changed, or how can those cultures be better informed? I think that's what I would say.
Thank you, Father Peter. We have another question. Sacrosanctum Concilium 45 is clear that every diocese is to have a commission on the sacred liturgy that operates under the bishop for promoting the liturgical apostolate. This is still not a reality here in Australia, even in some of our largest dioceses. One commission could also be shared by smaller dioceses. How can we address the need for responsive and ongoing formation in a way that supports people at the grassroots, especially those in financial need?
Yeah, good question. Yes, it is a matter of lament that many dioceses who enthusiastically set up liturgical commissions following the reform, over the years have disbanded those commissions for various reasons, some because of lack of personnel, some because of financial reasons, some simply because there was a falling away of enthusiasm. I think the suggestion that liturgical commissions might be shared between dioceses that are better resourced than others, I think is an eminently good one. And I think that might be a matter that might be taken up by the current National Liturgical Council, and they could explore that as being a way in which better resourced dioceses, at least from a liturgical expertise point of view, might be able to reach out to other dioceses who don't have those same provisions. I think that's a very good point indeed.
Thank you, Peter.
Peter, we have a question from Mary Tinney, who has written, is the Novus Ordo under regular review in light of developing theology such as eco-theology and feminist theology? These would challenge dualistic and non-inclusive liturgical formulae.
Sure. The answer to that question is I don't know. I don't know what the working brief of the Congregation for Divine Worship and the Discipline of the Sacraments is in Rome. Whether they are constantly reviewing the liturgical rites in order to bring out a new editio typica, I actually can't answer that question. I would hope that at least there are some people in the congregation in Rome who do engage in constant review of the typical editions. There would seem to be evidence that that does happen, because periodically we see the emergence or the publication of a new rite in Latin, which then gets translated into vernacular languages. So I assume there is some work in that going on, but I actually wouldn't know specifically.
Thank you, Father Peter. Bernard Kirkpatrick has a question. Bernard, you're going to turn on your mic and ask your question. Welcome. Can't hear you yet, Bernard.
Mike's off.
Yeah.
Unmute. Am I unmuted yet?
You're unmuted now.
Oh, yes. Sorry, everybody. That's my somewhat hopeless technological ability. Claire, look, I've just finished typing the question. Actually, if I just send it to you, would you like to read it out? Or make a good comment just briefly. Look, one point that hasn't been mentioned, and it's been a thought in my mind for quite some time, in the bigger cities now, we have so many Christians and Catholic people that come from not just the Latin Rite background, and we haven't really mentioned the Eastern rites here. In Western Sydney, we have many families, for example, Lebanese, Syrians, Egyptians, who send their kids to Catholic schools, Latin Rite schools, and who have a significant participation in many Latin Rite parishes, but technically they're still connected to their Eastern churches and their Eastern parishes, and they do often go between the two Eastern-West liturgical experiences. I suppose my question here is, there seems to be, I think, a different sort of expectation on the part of those who are Eastern Church people to those who are Latin Western Church people. And I'm just wondering, what are the challenges that Father Peter sees here in trying to sort of bring some sort of, I suppose, uniformity across the two lungs of the church, so to speak, and not just the challenges, but what sort of the cross-fertilisation benefits that might come from these people and their cultural experiences that they bring to Australian Catholic Church?
That's a very good question, Bernard, and one in which I'll have to be careful here because I have one Maronite student in my class, so he may well be on to me at the end of this. Look, I have quite a bit of experience with the Maronite Church, having been involved in the local parish of Harris Park when I was parish priest of the Latin Rite parish. And so I was introduced into that unique culture and language to a degree. Have a little smattering of Aramaic and a little smattering of Arabic. And I found again that while there is something to be gained by being informed about the richness that comes liturgically from the other Eastern rites, can I just suggest from my own observation, and my class member here may well have a view on this, I think in many respects they are probably faced with the same problems that we are faced with the Latin Rite. My experience is that while the Rite is very rich and they have their own liturgical traditions, the sense of engagement by people who attend Maronite masses that I've been to is about the same as what you would experience in a Latin Rite church. So I'm not sure whether my student would agree with that. He probably would. He's shaking his head in agreement, so there you are. He obviously wants a high mark for this course. I think that, yes, I think there's a bit more to be done there, Bernard. So I think what maybe we need to do is perhaps if there's a liturgical commission or liturgical response, people who are responsibility within the Eastern rites, maybe there needs to be some cross-fertilisation between the Latin Rite liturgical people and the Eastern Rite people. And maybe it would be a good thing to organise an occasion to bring people together to start to discuss what might be shared, what might be learned from the experience. We've never done that, by the way, and I think that's poor. And I know that there are within the Maronite community, there are liturgical experts. Father Jeffrey Abdallah, for one, who recently completed a doctorate in Rome in liturgy at the Orientum. I think maybe that might be something that, again, I'm not wanting to put things back on Paul Taylor and the National Liturgical Council, but maybe that's something that could be profitably done.
Thanks so much, Peter, and thanks, Bernard, for the question. Kathy's got a comment here, Peter, and a question. You highlight well how personal taste and preferences are central for many. What do you think has happened to the rich guiding documents such as the General Instruction of the Roman Missal and Sacrosanctum Concilium as universal reference points? Do you think that acceptance of these blueprints is an issue for us?
Yes, well, Kathy, I think it would be helpful if people actually read them. I think I have always encouraged anybody who studies liturgy here at Strathfield, but particularly if they're seeking ordination or even if they're not and they're wanting a good understanding of the liturgy, is the necessity of having a very detailed knowledge of what these documents contain. And the fact is that you wouldn't want to go to an assembly of a clergy gathering and ask the question, when was, to do a straw poll and ask of all the clergy, the deacons and the priests who were there, when was the last time you actually read the General Instruction of the Roman Missal? I think it would be very depressing, the response.
Thank you, Peter. David Tonks has a question for you here. Do you think that online masses have helped people rediscover the significance of the Word of God as nourishment for our spirits? Put in another way, has it increased our respect for Protestant churches that seldom celebrate Eucharist?
Well, look, I think if somebody, as I referred to in my lecture, of a friend of mine who is a member of a religious congregation, she found during the lockdown, she found a place in the United States of America where obviously the proclamation of the word and the preaching resonated with her to such a degree that she found that she was nourished as a result of the exposure. So the short answer is, if you happen to find a place online where not only the proclamation of the word is good, and I have to say, increasingly I find now that those who are charged with the responsibility of reading the scriptures in church do so much better than probably what they did 20, 30 years ago. And then you've got a very good homilist. Well, of course, people are going to be nourished. So therefore, there's obviously something to be gained. So if you land on an online liturgy where the homilist and where the actual proclamation of the word is of a very high standard, well, then of course you're going to benefit.
Marvellous. Thank you, Peter. Were there other questions that folks wanted to advance here in response, or comments you'd like to make? I have one just to fill the space for a moment. The Plenary Council seems to not, in the documentation that's come out so far, or what we've heard of it, doesn't really seem to have seen liturgy and its celebration as a major consideration. What are your thoughts on that, Peter? And how might it be raised up in status as something that's actually really important?
Yeah, I was disappointed when I read the preparation documents that were meant to focus on liturgy. It was I found it was very, very diluted, and it didn't really. I mean, it just used a whole lot of buzzwords like, oh, you know, our liturgies could be more joyful and more enlivening, and you know, they could be more inclusive. Well, none of that was unpacked. And so therefore, it seems to me that there hasn't been very much thought given at all to the capacity of liturgy, as we well know from the Constitution, to actually evangelise, because liturgy celebrated well is capable of being an evangelistic tool. But there is no mention about that. The only one of the suggestions, of course, that came up during the plenary council that got some airtime was a suggestion that came about, well, perhaps it's time that the church looked at the possibility of having lay preachers, that is, suitably trained and prepared women and men who might be asked to perhaps give a homily at a liturgical celebration. But that, because there was a general view, I think, which was not stated so much in the first session which I was at, but at least not in the groups in which I participated, but you got the sense that we have actually reached a point where there seems to be dissatisfaction from a whole lot of people, particularly about the standard of preaching. And that was, I think, why that particular topic came to the fore. But that was really the only one, Claire, that I thought came out of the plenary council of any date.
It may also be indicative, Peter, of the need for, as you mentioned, for a lot more formation, both of clergy and lay people. If the liturgy really is the source and summit of the Christian life, why is it completely ignored in the papers, in my view? Anyway, that's a whole nother conversation. Charles Roux has another comment here. Enculturation is integrally linked to community and its lived experience of faith. The local parish priest and bishop have an active role to judge what cultural expressions enhance local faith expressions. The South Korean church formally addressed issues such as honouring ancestors and celebrating harvest time. As the nation industrialised and was urbanised, the experiences of the YCW in factories was fed into the Sunday Mass. Enculturation was formally sanctioned. It seems to be a duty of leadership to facilitate this process. Comments, Peter?
No, I absolutely concur with what he's saying, and the experience, particularly in a place like Korea, but elsewhere. In my little overture before I began the lecture proper, there was in fact a clip there, just they're only ever 30-second clips, but there was a clip, and I'm sorry I couldn't have showed more of it, but of the celebration of the Eucharist in the cathedral in Osaka in Japan. And there you could see the fruits of Japanese culture finding a very beautiful expression in the celebration of the Roman Rite. It's worth actually looking up.
Thank you, Peter. Anybody else have a question, comment? Any of our clergy present want to make a comment? Father Paul Sirah, hello, our lovely Carmelite friend.
Hello, Claire.
Hello.
Yeah, just have probably a comment and a query, Peter. Is that I've been supplying in the country Victoria in the last 5 years, and I've come across some of the outstation parishes, might say very comfortable in their own country practice of liturgy. And I find it pretty sad because I felt that they haven't been having the kind of formation to help them to embrace some of the liturgical practice that we have. Like, for instance, I was doing the Good Friday and or Holy Thursday, and they have their own rules altogether, and it's hard to really change in terms of things like washing the feet or prostrating, all that. They have different things, and I just found it a bit hard to kind of say, oh, let's change because I'm a visiting priest. So what will be probably some of the things that we could help in the country practice?
Yes, hi Paul. I'm glad to see you. Look, I think that one of the reasons why the ACU Centre for Liturgy was established was in fact to address the very issue that you're raising. And when the early discussions were taking place about the establishment of the centre, and as Claire pointed out, I serve on the advisory board and have since the centre was established some years ago, was to provide a resource that would in fact be able to assist rural and remote dioceses. And that was one of the big selling points when the proposition was put to the Australian Catholic Bishops' Conference as to why having the Centre for Liturgy was a very good thing to do. And I'm happy to say that because of online capacity to have formation programs, it makes it much easier for the centre to be able to engage in this work. Now, the gap is, how do you get that message across? And ACU the Centre for Liturgy does a lot in promoting the courses and the various programs that they run, but that there's still a gap there. And maybe it might be a good thing for us to discuss at our next Board of Advisors meeting as to how we might actually get the message out to remote places like where you're serving to make things available for people. I think that's how I would come at that, because I would expect that the diocese can't have somebody working in an office for worship or a liturgy office, and so therefore it's not possible to be able to do it locally, but it might be possible to do it through the Centre for Liturgy.
Thanks, Peter.
Thank you both to Paul and Peter. Any other questions or comments from our participants today?
Any question from my class?
Yes.
Anybody got something? Come on, you're on a worldwide audience here. This will give you a big opportunity to show your... They're all camera shy.
I'd like to ask a question, Claire.
Sister Jill, welcome.
Thank you, Claire. Peter, I'm wondering about religious after the council. I think by and large, some of them jumped in and there was a lot of liturgical education. It costs money to educate people liturgically. Where have we put our minds and our hearts to how we can give good liturgical education to people who will be the teachers in the dioceses in the future?
That's a really good point you've made, Jill. One of the things I remember when I assumed the role of being Executive Secretary for the Bishops' Commission for Liturgy, it was at a conference in Adelaide, and when I took over from Tom Ellick. And I remember at that conference, which we had in Adelaide, I think at the Passionist Monastery in Adelaide, my memory serves me correct.
In the year 2000?
Yes, thank you, Jenny. There was a very substantive push by your own congregation of the Sisters of the Good Samaritan to address the very issue that you've raised in your comment, because and I can't remember who it came from, although Jenny might remember, but right back then, you know, this is going back a long time ago now, that need for ongoing liturgical education within Australia, and you're quite right, because most of us who studied liturgy formally, academically, all had to go overseas to do it. So, you know, in my case, I went to the Catholic University of America. In Jenny's case, she went to Rome, to St. Anselmo's. I think, Jill, from memory, you went to the United States of America. I mean, we all had to go overseas, and that's very expensive. Now, again, to come back, you know, this is not a paid commercial for ACU, but one of the things that Claire has been endeavouring to do, both within the Centre for Liturgy, but also through the Faculty of Theology, is to promote the fact that we have to have the capacity to liturgically educate people well within Australia, which thereby makes it affordable. And I think we just haven't got that lift yet that we probably need. There are graduates from various institutions around Australia who graduated in liturgical studies, and they're doing good work. But we need to do something. We need to do something more substantial than what we've done in the past. But I agree with you entirely, and it has to be done within Australia. And we have the expertise here. It's not as if we don't have the competent people here to be able to teach. We do. But again, it's a case of getting the message out there, I think.
Jenny wants to jump in.
Yes, I just would like to say that I think that we need an interim level, or a level between just being an ordinary parishioner and then engaging in an academic course. People are afraid, and I have found that when I work at the parish level, and I actually give them quite significant input and so on, people are absolutely thrilled to be able to learn, and they are really yearning for more. But there are two barriers. A, their fear of not being able to cope with what they call, you know, tertiary education, and B, the cost. And the cost is really substantial. And I mean, I'm starting another course on the 26th of May. We have already about 30 applicants. They simply would not be able to pay to do many of the online courses. Even that wonderful course that you've just put online for the Extraordinary Ministers of Holy Communion. And I just applaud that so much, because you're obviously giving a really in-depth look at the whole thing. It's not just an hour thing that come and do this and you'll be right. It's actually understanding the whys and wherefores. And that we've got to have some way in which we can give that initial push to people, let them whet their appetite, and then have a manner in which they can engage in that deeper level of learning, which will then really fire them, not just encourage them, but fire them up. And I think that what you said about the plenary council proposals, Peter, I agree. I was so disappointed. They were so pathetic and weak when it came to liturgy. And we need to have something much more at the ground roots that bounces people into the more in-depth study.
Could I make another comment there, please?
Quickly, Jill, yep.
Just further to what you've said, I think, Jenny, I can remember years ago, Mark Smith and I were doing some work in a country diocese, and we decided we'd do text study. And here we were sitting down with the texts and going through it, unpacking it, and Peter, you mentioned that, unpacking the texts. And as we went on, the level of anger sort of started to rise, and people said, why haven't we been told this? Exactly. So I think the hunger, well, it was there, I don't know what's happened to it, but there has been a lack of enthusiasm, I think, in recent years. Anyway.
Thank you, Jill. Thank you, Jenny.
Claire, could I just make one comment?
Very quickly.
Yeah, I think another block to pick up from what Jill and Jenny were saying is, in our diocese, lay people have put in a lot of time, and we have done thorough formation with them on the rites. They know a lot more about some of the rites than the clergy, and then they try to minister in their parish, and they're stomped on by the clergy who use their power and just say no. So people have put in the time and the hours and loved their formation, but then they just totally withdraw because their experience is it's a waste of time.
Yes.
Thanks, Louise. Folk, we're actually a little tiny bit over our time allotment. I think our conversation is just starting to get very fired up, and I'm sorry to have to cut it off. But Peter, we thank you so much, and we're tremendously grateful both for your public lecture and for your excellent responses to the excellent questions that have been raised by our participants today. So please, everybody, join me in a virtual round of applause for our wonderful speaker, Father Peter Williams. We're so pleased, Peter. Thank you. And we do come to the end of our time today, folks, but I would like to invite you to perhaps mark in your calendar our next public lecture, which will be in July the 18th in Australia, July the 17th in the US, and it will be given by Reverend Dr. Paul Turner, who is well known to many of you, and he will be speaking about celebrating Catholic funerals in the face of secularism, COVID and other challenges. So I do encourage you to keep your eyes open for that forthcoming public lecture and maybe make some time to join us again then. We are very grateful to you all for your participation, and especially to our speaker Peter and our respondent Jenny and all of the questioners and those of you who have been taking it all in and listening so well. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to have you. We look forward to seeing you again soon. Bye-bye.